Hello, everyone. My name is Saeed Atif Rizwan. I welcome you to the Oxford Interfaith Forum. I would say good afternoon since I'm here in Chicago, but I know that we have a lot of friends in Europe, so it'd be good evening and perhaps others throughout the world. And so perhaps a good morning would be appropriate as well. But nevertheless, thank you all for making the time for joining us today. The conversation we're going to have is very important for a host of reasons, among them being the current situation we find ourselves with all the conflicts around the world and the sad resulting deaths that have been occurring and what that means for individuals and families and for communities. And so I look forward, like you all, to hear from our wonderful and distinguished guests. Professor Salih Sayilgan is an assistant teaching professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Georgetown University here in the US. His research concentrates on Islamic theology, spiritual ethics, Quranic studies, Islam in America, as well as Christian-Muslim relations. He's the author of several books, including An Islamic Jihad of Nonviolence, Saeed Nursi's perspective. Dr. Peter Admirand is deputy in the School of Theology, Philosophy, and Music, and he's also associate professor of theology and the director of the Center for Interreligious Dialogue at Dublin City University. He has published several academic articles and journals, and among them is his most recent book, The Last of Us: Violence, Ethics, and Redemption? Published in 2024 as part of the Bloomsbury series, Theology, Religion, and Pop Culture. Among his previous books include Destruction, Ethics, Intergalactic Love, Exploring Why, The Last Man, and Saga, which was published in 2023 by Routledge. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Sayilgan, and the steering wheel is yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Rizwan. Thank you, everybody, especially Professor Admirand, for willing to be part of this panel and respond. And of course, Oxford Interfaith Forum, Thea and her team. Really, I'm so honored to be part of this program. So what I will do, let me just see if I can share my screen. So this will just help me to put everything together. Let me see. This is, when it comes to working on a book, of course, it takes a number of years, right? But I will do my best to really to tell the story of my book. What are some of the things that we can highlight, and then and hopefully we'll have some time for discussions. One thing is that basically that why it is a problem. I have been teaching a course called The Problem of God, and then part of this I teach the same theme, right? And again, it seems, in my studies, teaching, this is one of the most challenging questions to religious traditions, to idea of theism, to idea of faith, right? And some scholars actually they refer to this question, the question of evil and suffering, as evil and suffering as the rock of atheism. So meaning that basically this is the strongest argument against religion, against the idea of God, right? And there are surveys actually, right? So then, like so much curiosity from both sides, from religious and non-religious side, that if someone would meet God, really, what would they ask? And then the most common question would be why is there pain and suffering, right? So then this is like in the minds of many people, regardless of where they stand concerning religion. And also the idea of that there is inconsistency with the religious argument. Like one is usually it is worded as logical and evidential problem. So if you say God is compassionate, benevolent, all-knowing, powerful, then why so much evil and suffering? And again, the current situation of the world is a testament to this question, right? That so many children are being killed before our eyes, and then I mean, where to put God and religion in this picture, right? So just to give a few examples, so one of actually the first argument in the context of evil and suffering against religion, against the idea of God, comes from Epicurus. This is prominent Greek philosopher, and then the idea is that basically, if you say there is a powerful being who has the knowledge and the ability to prevent evil, then how do you explain the evil and suffering that exists in the world, right? We see David Hume, one of the influential uh, philosopher of the Enlightenment, who wrote significantly on the problem of evil, right? Or just in challenges against religion, the idea of God, right? Again, in line with Epicurus, that basically there is a logical problem with this religious argument. It just doesn't make sense. Similar argument from John Stuart Mill, again, influential philosopher in the European context, right? That even not even on the most distorted and the idea is that even if you have a distorted understanding of the world, what is before you, you still come to the conclusion that there is, that there is no an omnipotent good being, right? It just doesn't make sense, right? Because there are so many examples of, I mean, if you think of he comes to the conclusion that the order of things in this life is often an example of injustice, not justice, right? If you want to see what kind of order is, but this is, if there is anything that this order manifests, it is actually injustice. So it is difficult. And again, similar arguments from Charles Darwin, right? Especially in the context of animal suffering, right? So it is not just human suffering, but also the enormity in the context of animal suffering. And again, one of the arguments from a religious perspective, right, this idea of greater good, right? Again, he raises the question, what advantage would come out of this animal suffering, right? You think the way that our globe works. Again, those of you who are familiar with the writings of Dostoevsky, it's actually a major theme in his writings, especially there is the chapter in the brothers Karamazov rebellion, and then basically in a way, his major character Ivan is the one who raises so many questions in about the nature of the world in the context of evil and suffering, where eventually he comes to the conclusion, I mean, no one would be an architect of a world in which innocents suffer, right? That if there is innocent suffering in a place, in part of creation, no one would be willing to. And then he asks actually the other character, like, would you be willing to be the architect of a world that requires the suffering of innocence, like for the world to run, right? And again, like a major theme of really literature. Another interesting example comes from Simon Blackburn, the British philosopher, and he uses the analogy of dormitory, student residence. So imagine, and sometimes on campus, I also have, when I have a problem, I call actually the facility, and he uses the idea of, let's say you have the facility or the department of facility management, and they're supposed to repair things, right? So if there is such department, of course, naturally, when you have a problem, they're supposed to show up to fix your problem. And he links this analogy to the idea of God, that if God is powerful, compassionate, all-knowing, of course you would expect God to to give you some signs, to show up, like when people they face injustice, when there is innocent suffering. So this is all in the context of really major attributes of God in Abrahamic traditions and challenges from non-theistic perspective, right? The other thing is just part of really the story of my book, and again, I have been this is almost like a decade. I have been teaching, the problem of evil and suffering on campus, but also in the prison context, actually. In the U.S., I teach both in the state prison as well as federal prison. So one of the interesting thing, when you students they come to the classroom, in both contexts, they are very divided. Like they all have this absolute like stark positions. But somehow this, when you engage them with problem of evil suffering, actually it humanizes all the perspectives, right? That basically they are able to relate to each other, because suffering is a universal, like suffering or experience, even evil is a universal thing, right? That people they go through, and then when they see that both sides they struggle, because eventually, I mean, there is a struggle from both sides. There is no, I think still, I wrote a book, I teach, but it's one of the most complicated matter. There is so much mystery around it, like without, regardless of the approach that you take. So, I mean, I like to see also as a unifying, I mean, yes, there are challenges, but also it can be actually a unifying uh, area too. Like if you, the field of evil and suffering can actually unite people of different faiths and people of no faith, actually. So just to understand, to relate to each other, right? And when someone suffers, actually, again, it humanizes everything, including perspectives. So what is the Islamic contribution, to come to our point? Like I will highlight a few things. So one is basically part of the mainstream Islamic theology is this world, the creation is the manifestation of God's names, right? So this is the idea of creation. God has all this beauty, skills, and it was just natural for God to reveal himself, right? And then to also create those who can relate to his revelation, right? So I think this is important to keep in mind as a departure point, right? But then once you see the creation as the manifestation of God, this manifestation will require diversity in creation. And this diversity is not just the creation of what is good, what is beautiful, but also the creation of evil and suffering, or the things that actually involves the creation that involves suffering as well. This is, and then through this diversity that we can know God, right? Imagine, like, sometimes I give the example of in the class, I give the example to a student that you only know me as an instructor, but I have many other hats in life, right? I am a parent, I am a colleague, I am a friend. So I have so many other hats in life. So for you to know me, you have to actually see me or engage with me in other contexts. Just to see a similar analogy, diversity in creation that involves also suffering is a way to know God, right? Let's say, do you want to I mean, if you think of one of the common attributes of God in religious traditions is the God as a healer, right? And then how do you know God as a healer, right? I mean, when you have a sickness, right? The idea, it becomes a way to know God. Or death. Death is known to be created by God. Like that is a manifestation of God's power and sign. And how do you know God again? And that is one of the ways to know God, or to know life, right? That how God name is manifested through life. And then a major, actually in this context, a major modern Muslim theologian from the Ottoman context, he gives the example of a fashion designer, like when it comes to creation that involves both evil, suffering, and goodness. Think of a fashion designer. Let's say the designer will hire someone and then basically will try different things on this person in order um, to reveal his skills. And likewise, God also has diversity in creation that involves suffering in order to reveal himself to humanity. And the other thing is that, of course, that the human's responsibility when it comes to evil and suffering is to long for moral justice, right? I mean, that there should be their moral responsibility and work for justice, right? That the fact that God is part of it, I think shouldn't. Sometimes I see the argument that, okay, it doesn't make it people passive, right, indifferent, when you know that God is taking care of everything. The answer from a theological perspective is no, actually, that you have also moral responsibility to respond, right, to change and stand for justice. And especially one of the, again, a major theology is that when it comes to things that happen, let's say, you lost a child, right? Or you had an accident, like something that happens, right? That involves suffering. Then with this, it becomes qadar, like it becomes your predestination, and you accept it. The best response to accept that this was part of my um, predestiny, right? And then with things yet to come, yet to happen, then you actually you respond with rationale. So then this is called like the with the things that has passed, you have a asharite response, meaning that you accept that this is from God. But things that yet to come, the future, you will respond with rationale. So you do basically, it is your responsibility, your own choice. And the other thing is so much emphasis on the life in the hereafter. I think it is fair to say that from an Islamic theological perspective, it's almost impossible to understand or accept God's justice without the idea of life after death. So then, the point is that eventually everything will be revealed in the hereafter. There are so many matters that are not resolved in this world, right? People who commit so many atrocities, they leave this world with dignity. There are innocents, their cases are not resolved. And again, we see today in the world, children are being killed in the context of Gaza, right? How can you, I mean, there is no justice that is revealed, and then how can you respond? And the answer is that eventually God's justice will be revealed, like there will be full revelation, right? So in this sense, so Islamic approach, we can say it's like a middle way, right? Yes, there is theology, there is faith, but also you have a practical response that, right? Whether this can come in the context of patience, be patient when you go through it, right? Acceptance, still have faith in God, but also fight for justice, right? Fight like for justice to make our world morally a better place when everyone has an equal share, right? Or shot. Oops, and then so I wanted actually to see if what captures the Islamic approach really in a profound way. So this is I don't know if you read in the news, there was like a major, how do you say, I mean, controversy in September in the U.S. about the execution of a Muslim inmate, right, who was in the prison in, I think it was in Missouri, for 24 years, but his case was contested, but eventually he was executed, right? So then I checked, just read his last statement. What was his last statement? And then they published his last statement. So this is again just 2 weeks ago. And then he's just on on official statement, there is just one phrase. And again, I don't know if you see on the screen, it says, "All praise due to Allah in every condition." So this is an Arabic phrase actually. It means, like, the Arabic version is Alhamdulillah ala kulli hal. So basically, we praise God in all conditions, no exception. And it comes from a report, from a hadith of the Prophet of Islam. And so it's interesting. The idea is that now you don't turn to God. You are not thankful to God only in good times, but also in all conditions. That I thought that this is actually his last statement is a beautiful way to capture Islamic theological approach to the problem of evil and suffering, right? And the last thing I wanted to conclude with words of Erzurum Ibrahim Hakkı. So this is a Sufi Ottoman scholar. So widely again shared his work in the context of evil and suffering. So I will read the Turkish version and then the translation, which is also part of my book too. Hak şerleri hayreyler, zannetme ki gayreyler. Arif anı seyreyler, Mevla görelim neyler, neylerse güzel eyler. Sen hakka tevekkül kıl, taviz et, rahat bul, sabr eyle ve razı ol. Mevla görelim neyler, neylerse güzel eyler. God turns evil into good. Never think that he does otherwise. Let's see then what God does. Whatever God does, he does it beautifully. Put your trust in God. Don't worry. Leave it to him. Be patient and accept it. Let's see then what God does. Whatever God does, he does it beautifully. Thank you very much. So I will now leave the stage to Peter.
Thank you so much for that fascinating and insightful presentation, Dr. Sayilgan. So yes, I'll turn now to Dr. Peter Admirand.
I'm going to read my statement, partly because, again, I want to get through this so we have more time for you guys to ask questions to Professor Sayilgan. I'll give initially a kind of overview of the book. I'll turn to my own journey because it's really important coming to this as a Catholic theologian for you to see what is leading me or how I'm reading Professor Sayilgan's text. And then I'll also look at my own work in theodicy and how it compares with Professor Sayilgan, and then some issues or questions I would have. Okay. So first, I'm very grateful for this opportunity, both to have had the chance to closely read God, Evil, and Suffering in Islam, but then to have this opportunity to share my thoughts both with the author and with all of you. Again, that's an honor and a privilege. As a well-structured and clear resource to examine the problem of evil as seen through the Quran and some of the most important schools of Islamic theology, applied to very relatable themes of suffering that many of us experience, like sickness, loneliness, or old age. God, Evil, and Suffering would be of great benefit to both the student of religion more broadly, to Muslims, and to those seeking or trying to find meaning in the presence of God despite horrors in our world. While my own approach to theodicy, as I'll note below, would push back on some claims made in the book, claims, I should add, that would also resonate in much traditional Christian theodicy, I maintain that the unyielding trust in God presented here is humbling and inspiring, even if it may also be frustrating or seems impossible in the face of horrendous and excessive forms of radical evil and suffering. Thus, I'm not interested in, God, why did I get this paper cut or cold? Or even, why will I die one day? But in the extent and abyss of some atrocities in this world, from the genocide of Srebrenica, commemorated in the cover of Professor Sayilgan's book, to stories and witnesses of those who testify in the face of mass death and suffering, of their seeking a God of love and kindness, but meeting only silence and more suffering. So before I initially go down some of that path, I just want to highlight especially chapter 9 in the book that I found really interesting, the environment and climate change, where Professor Sayilgan's inclusion in the book of Islamic ecological theology as a response to the environmental crisis, page 158, and what he later describes as eco-jihad are very valuable and I think really interesting, obviously for Muslims, but certainly for everybody. I also love his highlighting of the overlooked virtue of frugality. So interesting, frugality. We think about how bounteous our world is, full of water and food, but people are starving and thirsty because we take too much. The virtue of frugality is something we don't often focus on, and I thought it was brilliant to highlight it there. I also love the sentence in the section examining innocent suffering in the Mutazalit school, where he says that God has an ethical obligation to compensate animals for their suffering. Page 65, really interesting. And likewise, I'd like to know more about the greening of Ramadan, the greening of interfaith events in general. Again, I think a really rich chapter in particular, I wanted to highlight that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to sort of present 7 main themes that I think encapsulate a lot of my position of where I'm coming from. Because it's one thing for me to read the book, but it's important for you to say, well, what's his take? Why does he think the way he does? Because we're all, right, subjective in that sense. The first one's going to be a bit long, so bear with me. The other 6 are not. The first one I would say is very traditional, normal Christian thinking, but I kind of emphasize that because the other ones you would be more liberal, more critical, more pluralist, okay? In some ways, that's the conflict because it's both issues. So, number 1, my lodestar and guiding light is my understanding, hopefully nurtured and reflected in the Spirit of God, which is universal love, embodied in the actions and words of Jesus of Nazareth, whom I believe is God made flesh, God incarnate. Such Christological thoughts and actions are infused by what liberation theologians call a preferential option for the poor and oppressed, characterized by a commitment to social justice, community, dialogue, nonviolence, and discipleship. My Christ is kenotic, self-emptying power that serves, not rules, encapsulated in Jesus's dialogue with the Syrophoenician woman, whose daughter Jesus healed and whose words enlightened Jesus. Both types of miracles. The death and resurrection of Jesus, moreover, are a testament and outcome of a life unafraid to speak truth to power. Jesus did not die in a garden, did not die because someone made mistakes in a garden, but because of a life devoted to a love of God, friend, and so-called enemy. And when you do this, this often results in the cross. So again, it's not that God needed some blood or some vengeance. It's that when you live a life of social justice, unfortunately, that sometimes comes with a price. Moreover, as Jesus is again for Christians fully God and fully human, we believe that God entering into our world, entering into flesh, made him particularly aware of the suffering and injustice in our world. And so that Jesus can be a point of solidarity for many people who suffer anguish, horror, misery, and torture. But again, according to the Christian story, he rises again. And so this means that there's an answer to the problem of suffering. So pretty traditional Christian thinking. Now let's hear a couple of the other elements. So 2, my theology has a deep and sometimes scathing critique of institutional and individual Christian and church moral failures. A lot I can say, but we'll move on. 3, a need for dialogue and listening to all those around us, of all faiths and none. From Christians, Hindus, Muslims, atheists, you name it, we need to listen to all of them. More and more, too, non-human species, right? How can we learn from those, or nature around us, or the cosmos? There's so much to teach us as well. The main thing is that this kind of dialogue leads to humility, and that's point 4. Ultimately, all faiths, this is my position, all faiths and philosophical positions are in need of some humbling, or are in some way flawed or broken. Again, I don't think any particular faith is 100% has all the truth, all the answers. They're all broken. An atheist can't say, we have 100% truth. A Christian can't say it. A Hindu can't say it. Nobody can say it. We're all humbled by different reasons, but partly because all faiths have failed in some ways to actually bring about the reign of God among us. 5, the problem of evil cannot be solved by any clever, creative theological gymnastics or contortions. And Professor Sayilgan says something very similar. The horrors of useless evils, of cries and pleas seemingly unaddressed in this world by both humans and perhaps even by God, cannot be wiped out by a text from a holy book, a demand of faith and trust. This would be some differences that I'll highlight later. Such horrors linger and leave both scars and haunting echoes. 6, I stand with Jewish Rabbi Irving Greenberg's creed, spoken upon reflection, based on the witness of Auschwitz survivor Elie Wiesel, also my former teacher, who witnessed Nazis throwing live Jewish babies into the flames. And this creed challenges, quote, no statement, theological or otherwise, should be made that would not be credible in the presence of burning children. This, of course, makes the work of theodicy, the work of any kind of theology, very, very difficult. 7, the problem of evil and theodicy cannot be bypassed. So in Christian European thinking, particularly after the Shoah, there was a strong movement to say theodicy is immoral, that theodicy shouldn't be done. But the problem is, if you avoid theodicy, how can you actually have a theology? So ultimately, I think you have to work through the problem of theodicy, but that's going to lead to a kind of fracturing of your own faith tradition because, look, there are no answers. We'll talk a bit about answers in the afterlife, but that's a holding off. That's a suspension. In this particular world, we're still dealing with the broken or the fracturedness. So, as you see here, this means we are all left with fractured faiths built upon fractured theodicies. So, next part of this, in my 2012 book, where I'm dealing with theodicy, my initial aim was to seek out memoirs and testimony. So I begin with the victims' voices. That means that some of these words are very, very disturbing and also very, very challenging because many of them are not faith believers. If we read a memoir, Muslim, Hindu, Christian, Buddhist, where their faith is still maintained despite the horrors, yes, we can be troubled, but also perhaps be comforted. But when you read memoirs and testimonies from people who are broken, who find no hope, who prayed to God, but felt God never answered their prayers, who felt and were helpless when other people suffered in front of them, that becomes very difficult to respond theologically. So I used those victims' voices as my really starting point, and then turned to three broad areas. So Christian philosophical theodicy, some of it like John Paul II, Salvificae Dolores would resonate a bit with Professor Sayilgan's book, D.Z. Phillips, Marilyn McCord Adams, among others. Liberation theology, because again, they're focused on the poor and the oppressed, and then Jewish post-Holocaust thought. So I use these sort of main areas. I would have used Professor Sayilgan's book if that had been published in 2010, 2011, when I was working on the 2012 book, maybe in the next one. So from those discussions and the dialogue between the memoirs and testimonies of genocides in Rwanda and Srebrenica in Cambodia, you name it, and then in dialogue with these thinkers in Christian philosophical theology, Jewish post-Holocaust thought, and liberation theologians, I came up with these 5 criteria for what I call a viable theodicy. Again, the theodicy is broken because we can't solve it. We can't justify it. But these are the kind of attempts I'm making to claim why faith can still be possible despite the wounds, despite the fracturedness. I have them listed here. I'll name them, but then fill in some links I find with the book. So the first one, it should employ a pastoral approach informed by a post-Holocaust perspective. So pastoral theology is care of the soul. And I see much of this in Professor Sayilgan's book. It's profoundly and practically pastoral in every good sense, both as informative and as intending to offer words of hope, solace, and comfort to those struggling with suffering and evil. My post-Holocaust perspective is very unique to my generation as a Catholic theologian because of what the Shoah did. But I would say others might have something else that could replace that. Those in Rwanda might say the Rwandan genocide. But the point is some kind of cataclysmic historical event that seems to upturn most moral and theological thinking. So the Shoah does that for Christian thought. Okay. So 2, it should testify to the pervasive goodness of creation and the need for a disinterested faith. If a theodicy seeks to maintain belief in and love of God, it is essential to highlight the goodness and holiness of creation. You can't say this world is worth praising if ultimately we're saying it's evil and bad and awful, right? So we have to ultimately believe this world is good, despite the existence of suffering and sometimes extreme suffering in our world. And this is very difficult. A disinterested faith is a very specific notion, and I'd be curious how it plays out in Islam because I do see it there very much so. To a point, I should say to a point. A disinterested faith is love of God without need of reward or expectation of reward. I cannot master this, okay? But I do see this as a crucial element for how someone could maintain faith in God. Why? Because in our world, there's no guarantee bad things won't happen. Bad things happen to good people, good things can happen to bad people. So a disinterested faith loves God regardless of what happens. Again, I'm not saying that I can live up to that ideal, but I do think it's something that we probably need to practice, okay? And just on that line, though, I agree with Professor Sayilgan on page 186, who says, without life after death, it is problematic to argue that God is just and benevolent. I would completely agree. But because of that, I understand why many atheists and others are not satisfied because they say that's not enough. I also want to bring up now how some believers who suffered are very wary of the afterlife healing their wounds in this world. Okay, so those of us who believe, we might say, oh, God will find a creative way to heal everyone. But it's complicated, obviously. And some thinkers, some survivors are rebelling against that notion for ethical reasons. 3, it should promote a prayerful commitment to remember the victims of atrocity. This remembering, I contend, especially involves stories of the broken, those who do not die with the name of God on their lips, or those who do. So again, I think those stories have to be part of the tradition and need to be dealt with. In Professor Sayilgan's book on page 129, we get an example of this. There's a terrible story of a young teenage girl who gets violated, gets murdered, And then some of the accounts that end up happening, the murderer is falsely accused, is the wrong person is accused, and then finally they have the right person. But again, I would just argue for the need to have stories as well where there is no hope. I mean, there's no justice, there's no answers that come, because I think we need to sit with those a bit longer. And again, I think that should be part of our memory, part of our liturgy, part of our religious work. 4, it should integrate theological protest and radical forgiveness and praxis. I'll combine them both. In Professor Sayilgan's work, it's wonderful focus on the real world, doing good works, the need for compassion. This isn't just a theoretical, I have to say, I don't like theoretical theodicies that are just purely A equals B equals C equals D equals E. We need to be engulfed in the real world with real suffering to make theodicy meaningful. And part of that is both praxis, because we need to make the world better if we're going to talk about a love of God and the world being good. And again, we see this repeatedly throughout. One little bone to pick is that on the one hand, on page 184, Professor Sayilgan talks about how everyone can be compassionate. So that echoes kind of the Dalai Lama saying we don't even need religion because we all have this innate compassion. But then, there's a bit of a backtrack on page 5, maybe a misreading on my part, where I quote, "First, unlike atheist arguments, mercy, compassion, and solidarity infuse the world." Again, I think some atheists might have that, but some atheists also argue the world is beautiful. The world is great. Think of Steven Pinker, not necessarily a fan of religion by any means, but who makes the claim that the world is actually getting morally better. So, just kind of the call for nuance in some of these things. When it comes to radical forgiveness, again, an amazing story, and we even see that in the presentation earlier with the prisoner who's sentenced to death. But this is a story of Abdul Monim Sambat Jitmad, who Professor Sayilgan highlights, page 35 to 36, whose son was murdered, and yet this man, and who among us could do this, right? Forgives the murderer and calls to the murderer to repent and tells him to turn to God. Again, amazing, right? This kind of forgiveness. But I think it needs to be balanced by protest. I'm not convinced enough there's enough protest here. I think the Jewish tradition of arguing with God is very important. I think in the Christian tradition, it was overlooked for too long in the John Paul II papacy. I think without lament, public lament and protest, I think we have problems in some of our religions. Again, just my view. Although I do note, really interesting, and I need to read up more on this, that in the epigraph of Professor Sayilgan's book, he quotes Quran 12:866, "I complain to my sorrow and grief to God alone." So there is lament in the Quran here. It's just to God, it's private. So there can be room, I think, here for back and forth overlap. So anyway, interesting stuff. What I'm kind of asking for in terms of Professor Sayilgan is really just the sense of how mass atrocities fit into some of these responses to God that involve just trust, that involve just, this is part of God's plan. I kind of balk at that when it comes to the extent of evils. I'm with Ivan Karamazov that one murder alone could be enough to question God, but I think genocides are even kind of worse in that sense. So I'd like to know more about what is testing or predestination? How does that really work when we're dealing with that extent of that kinds of evil? So anyway, I'll stop now. But again, ultimately, it was really a great honor to read this book. It's one I'll certainly be using in class going forward.
Thank you so much for that enriching response, Dr. Admirand. So I'll turn it back to Dr. Sayilgan.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Admirand, for your thoughtful and generous, response. I mean, there is so much actually to engage, right, to response. But I just let me go with a few things that you said toward the end. So one is the question of wrestling with God, right? We know that this is very much part of the Jewish tradition, very much emphasized. Yeah, the Quran actually mentions, like, this is the verse that you made reference to. It's part of the story of Joseph. So the Quran refers to the story of Joseph as one of the most beautiful stories. This is like David, basically Joseph's father, when in a way Joseph disappears, that he's lamenting. But one nuance is that he's not complaining from God, he's complaining to God. So this, I think this is, if I want to distinguish something, so the idea is that I think Muslims, of course, part of their grief, their suffering, when they go through evil, so there's always the idea of lament, through invocations, du'as, prayers, zikrs. They turn to God, right, for their laments, for their complaints, but they turn to God as a refuge, right? So that God is basically a safe refuge for you. You can, because again, think of when the world fails you, people, they abandon you, then it is God who is standing that you can turn to and seek refuge, right? So the idea of complaining to God is yes, but complaining from God is like complaining because of God seems not part of Islamic theology, right? Will be a far stretch, right? And the other thing is the idea of this interested faith, this Professor Admirand, the idea is that just simply can you continue your faith despite what you go through, right? Just to just without reward, right? And again, this actually is very much, there's so much literature, especially in the Sufi context. You just, the creation is as enough reason to turn to God. Like basically, you don't need the reward. Kind of this idea of transactions is not the reason to enough reason to turn to God. You just simply turn to God because this, and the idea is that you are so much awed by His beauty. Is just it's just a natural response. So when you look at His creation, especially through the names, compassion is everywhere, mercy is everywhere, um, and it is just your natural response to first that through the creation, through the words of God, you know Him. But once you know God, is worship is a natural response. So like it's not worship is not just it's your love actually. It's the idea of when you love someone, you have this, it will generate a natural response which comes again not just only in Islam but in many other religious traditions. It comes in a form of worship, so it's not transactional, right? But also we see the Quran uses the nature of the language of transaction too. Sometimes the idea of reward and punishment is also part of the language of the Quran, and this is also a human thing, right? So I think just that humans, they like this. Not that all humans are like reward oriented, but some people, they need this language for their motivation. Not all of them. So again, usually I give the example. So imagine speeding up on the highway, right? Is it speeding up? Is it? Why do some people they speed up, or some they don't, right? I think then you can come with many different answers. But certainly, when some people they see the sign that you will be fined or then you will be stopped by the police, right? This could be their motivation not speeding up. Right? If this is how you save people, you save their life, other people. I don't see anything wrong with it, right? In terms of their motivation, right? Because the outcome is beautiful, right? Eventually. So we see the Quran actually uses this language to deter people, sometimes to motivate them, and sometimes to deter them, right? But the heart of Islamic theology is really when it comes to worship in all conditions, right? Remember, I said, Alhamdulillah ala kulli hal, regardless of your state, is their love for God. That God is, God Himself is enough reason for them to turn to Him. Um, Another thing is this, the problem of evil. When it comes to do atheists, they see the world as kind of an evil, brutal place, right? But at least we see this is, it's very common, right? So maybe not in all cases, Professor Admirand. Then the interesting thing, like both theism, I think this is it's one of my conclusions. Both theism or religious traditions, especially here in the Abrahamic religion, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and theism, they take the same problem as their departure point, but with different conclusions. So the idea is that this world is too brutal, too frightening, too much evil and suffering. From an atheist perspective, there is no way we can justify the idea of a benevolent God. This is just is illogical, right? There is no reasoning this right there, right? And then from a theological perspective, I mean, yes, there is actually so many, I mean, apparent injustice, examples of injustice, suffering, evil, and this is actually the strongest argument that life should continue after death. Either God is not just, right? So interestingly, they both take, you know, the problem of evil as their departure point, you know, atheism and theism, but with different conclusions, right? So then, you know, the theism, like religious tradition, they say, well, then life should continue, then God will recompensate everyone, right? But then atheism, no, actually, we cannot accept this, right? So one, and the other thing is, does the idea of theodicy, especially when it comes to collective atrocities, you know, if you think of genocides, if you think of, you know, the innocent suffering, does it in a way make people passive? I think I see this is kind of a major question raised in various contexts. But at least I think this shouldn't be our conclusion of Islamic approach to evil and suffering, whether because of its emphasis that God is the creator of everything, God is behind of everything, that life continues after death, right? And there will be judgment. But still, there is so much emphasis on actually human responsibility, I would say. So much emphasis, you know, just that it is eventually it's your own responsibility. And then I want to actually reference one of the verses from the Quran. That's part of my discussion book too. It is actually interesting. It's the library of Harvard Law School. Few years ago they have this the walls of um, law. So basically on the wall they had like wisdom from about law from different religious traditions. So in the case of Islam they had actually a verse from the Quran. This is chapter 4 verse 135, and it says, I think it's one of, again, a major, like a key verses of the Quran about justice. You who believe, uphold justice and bear witness to God, even if it is against yourself, your parents, or your close relatives. Whether the person is rich or poor, God can best take care of both. Refrain from following your own desire so that you can act justly. If you distort or neglect justice, God is fully aware of what you do. So this is, again, I think just because of time, I don't need to read the Arabic version. But the idea is that the Quran is very clear, like when it comes to injustice, like someone is, you know, like kind of moral evil, you know, what people they do, evil, suffering, it's your responsibility to stand up. And sometimes when you think of what deters people from standing up for justice, sometimes it might be actually your country. You say that what the country that is committing atrocity is my country or my people or my ethnicity, right? Then actually I can keep my eye blind, right? I can say, oh, that's fine, or it's my tribe, it's my family, it's my family, they are involved in this injustice, so I can actually be on the other side, right? But his Quran actually gives like a principle that no, in any case, stand up for justice, speak up, right? When people are being killed, when there is an innocent suffering. So the idea is that I think, you know, this absolute emphasis on monotheism, God is in control, you know, turn to God, life continues after death. I mean, Muslims, they never understood as to be passive, I think, just to be indifferent to suffering. Thank you so much. So I want to stop here, so just to
Thank
see if
you.
we have some time. Yeah.
Well, thank you again, you know, Dr. Sayilgan for your insightful talk, and Dr. Admirand for, you know, your substantive response and engagement. Really a lot to chew on, and really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for joining today for this fantastic conversation. We will get the recording and eventually post it on the website and also circulate it on X. And please feel to refer back to it and share it. And with that, have everyone a great rest of the evening, rest of the day, and we'll send out more information about the next event. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.